You might think I'm a complete fool, the most oblivious husband ever, but let me tell you, hindsight makes everyone seem smarter. Beyond that, like many happily married men, I loved and trusted my wife completely. I never would have suspected that the woman I had adored and cherished for 8 years, sharing countless intimate moments and happy memories, was actually a selfish monster, or more precisely, one of 3 selfish monsters. You see, Molly has 2 sisters, and they've been a part of my life almost since day one. I had never met identical triplets before, and let me tell you, it was both thrilling and unnerving. It wasn't just that they looked alike, they were stunningly alike, and gorgeous at that. From our very first date, they were a package deal, in some way or another. I met Molly at a grocery store, of all places. She had asked me to reach the top shelf for some herbal tea, flashing a charming smile. Molly is petite, barely 5 feet 2 inches, with curves in all the right places and jet black hair cut short around her ears. I'm about 6 feet 0 inches, so naturally, I was her go-to guy for help with that top shelf tea. What I didn't know at the time was that Molly had already noticed me wandering around the produce section. She told me later, during our 4th date, that she thought I was cute and had been waiting by the tea aisle for just the right moment to ask for my help. It was flattering, no doubt about that. And when she told me this, we were lying in bed, basking in the afterglow of our first night together. It felt like the start of something amazing. Our first few dates were magical. We went to dinner and talked until nearly midnight, walked through the park feeding ducks, and even caught a cheesy romantic movie. We held hands the entire time. Corny, right? But I was completely captivated by her. Molly wasn't just beautiful, she had this girl-next-door charm with a smile that could melt the heart of an IRS auditor. But back to that first date. After I grabbed her tea and we struck up a conversation, she casually mentioned having sisters. I didn't think much of it at the time. But when I showed up at her apartment for our first official date, I was greeted by someone who wasn't Molly. She had the same dark hair, the same radiant smile, but it wasn't her. "Hi, you must be Scott," she said with a mischievous grin. I stammered, "You're not Molly." She laughed, and it was the same warm, playful laugh I had heard from Molly. "Nope, I'm Hannah. Molly, Amy, and I are triplets. Didn't she tell you about us?" If she had, I sure didn't remember. I was flabbergasted. "Oh, she does this sometimes, just to mess with people," Hannah said, still grinning. "Come on in, I'll go get her." Inside, sitting in the living room, was yet another Molly, except it wasn't. This one was Amy. They all had the same haircut, the same body, and the same dazzling smile. I didn't have a chance of telling them apart until the real Molly finally appeared from one of the bedrooms. "Hi, Scott. Would you like some herbal tea?" she asked with a wink, knowing full well she had already pulled one over on me. During that first dinner, Molly and I talked about everything under the sun, but I was especially curious about what it was like to be part of a set of triplets. Did she feel weird seeing her face in 2 other people every day? Were they closer than most siblings? Could they read each other's minds like twins are supposed to? Had they ever swapped places to mess with people? Molly smiled thoughtfully. "I don't know about reading minds, but we are super close. I can usually guess what Amy or Hannah is thinking, and they do the same with me. Like, they'll answer questions I haven't even asked yet. It's been that way since we were little. As for switching places, well, we might have done that a few times." Her smile grew wider, and I could tell she was thinking about some past prank. "When we were kids, we loved confusing people, teachers, relatives, even our parents. They couldn't always tell us apart. It was so much fun, especially if one of us got in trouble. If Amy did something bad, she'd just say, 'No, Dad, I'm Molly.' And sometimes it worked. I could only imagine how chaotic that must have been for their parents." "Things changed a bit in high school," Molly continued. "We wanted to establish our own identities, so we started doing different things, different hairstyles, different hobbies. I joined the yearbook staff, Amy got into writing for the school paper, and Hannah, well, she was into sports. As I listened, I realized how complex Molly's life must have been. Growing up as part of a trio like that must have shaped her in ways I was just beginning to understand. That night, I drove home thinking I had hit the jackpot with Molly. But looking back now, I wonder how much of what I thought was real, and how much was just part of the game she and her sisters had been playing all along. Newspaper and Hannah were on the same field hockey team, but after a few years, we began to notice that our skill sets were becoming less interchangeable. So, from time to time, we'd revert to our old arrangement. I'd take a chemistry test for Amy, and Hannah would handle an oral presentation for me. This little swap helped boost our grades and kept things manageable. One memorable incident happened during our junior year when Brad Hendrick asked Amy out on a date. Amy was completely smitten with him, and when she came down with the flu on the morning of their big night, she was devastated. She cried and fretted, convinced that if she canceled, Brad would never ask her out again. In a moment of empathy, she persuaded me to step in for her. It wasn't too difficult because it was their first date, and they didn't really know each other very well. That evening, I went as Amy, and the date went off without a hitch. After that night, Amy and Brad's romance blossomed, and they dated for almost a year. Amy never revealed to Brad that I had been her stand-in, which is a detail I've looked back on with some bitterness over the years. But as I sat across from the beautiful, cheerful, and charming Molly, I was captivated by her. The fact that she seemed to like me too felt like a miracle. After college, the three sisters had moved away, enjoyed their independence, and then eventually returned to Cincinnati. They found a spacious shared apartment, which is where I first met Molly's sisters when I went to pick her up for a date. Fast forward 8 years, Molly and I fell in love, got married, and I felt like the happiest person on earth. I had a job at a graphic design firm where my extensive computer experience made me a valuable asset, so I earned a good salary. We could easily afford a lovely 3-bedroom house in Oakley Square, just a few miles from work. 3 years into our marriage, Amy married a tall, somewhat unremarkable guy named Ted who worked in finance. He was friendly but rather dull. They ended up living next door to us on a quaint dead-end street called Ferdinand Place. Amy and Ted's yard overlooked the backyard of our house on Oak Park Place, where Hannah and her husband, Arnold, lived. Arnold Airy was the polar opposite of Ted. He was older, shorter, and had a jovial personality. He owned several bowling alleys in the Cincinnati area, smoked cigars, until Hannah made him quit, told hilarious and often risque jokes, and was a fantastic companion. Hannah and Arnold had married a few months before Amy and Ted. It wasn't surprising that our wives insisted on living so close to each other. They were like Siamese triplets, almost inseparable. Ted, Arnold, and I got used to their habit of finishing each other's sentences and saying the same things at the same time. We also became accustomed to their nightly ritual of gathering in one of our kitchens around 9:30 or 10 p.m. to chat before heading home to their respective husbands. Even after 8 years of marriage, I often found myself struggling to distinguish which sister was which. Ted and Arnold had the same problem. We all became adept at noting which clothes each wife was wearing or identifying specific pieces of jewelry. During Christmas gatherings with their parents, Pam and Donald, it was evident that even they had difficulty telling their daughters apart. Despite their similarities, each sister had her unique traits. Amy was the most reserved, practical, a bit prim, and conservative compared to her sisters. Hannah was the wild one, more likely to indulge in drinks, tell off-color jokes, and, though she never did, she'd be voted most likely to be a topless bar dancer. Molly, in contrast, was somewhere in between. She was sweeter and more outgoing than Amy but more grounded than Hannah. The differences between the sisters were apparent when we spent time together, but distinguishing them by eye or voice alone was nearly impossible. When they wanted to deceive you, you stood no chance. Since neither Molly nor I had children at the time, planning our vacations was relatively straightforward. As you might expect, Molly and her sisters insisted that the six of us vacation together every year. So, every summer, we'd take 2 weeks to explore somewhere exciting, Las Vegas, a beach resort in North Carolina, or even Italy one year. We were a fairly compatible group, so the husbands didn't mind too much. But in exchange for these joint vacations, I insisted on having a week away with just Molly, no Amy, no Hannah, no brothers-in-law. Initially, this was a significant point of contention. We had some heated arguments and icy silences over the matter. It took about 3 years before Molly truly understood that I was serious. I kept insisting, "I love your sisters and enjoy spending time with Ari and Ted, but I need some time just for us. Is it really so hard to understand? You get a 2-week trip with everyone every year, and I get 1 week alone with you." I must have given that speech at least 10 times, but it wasn't until the day before our trip to Italy, when Molly came home from work to find that I hadn't even started packing, that she finally gave in. That was the last straw. I told her, firmly, that if she didn't agree to spend that week with me, I'd stay home and let her go to Italy with the other couples without me. What followed was over an hour of heated arguments and about 20 phone calls to Amy and Hannah. Both sisters tried to intervene, explaining over and over how selfish and short-sighted I was being and that no loving husband would act this way. Despite their attempts to persuade me otherwise, I stood my ground. Eventually, Molly relented, and we went to Italy. For the first few days, things were pretty frosty between us, and her sisters seemed determined to remind me that I was in the doghouse. It was only with the support of Ari and Ted, who were quietly thrilled at my insistence because they hoped to use it as leverage with their own wives, that I didn't give up and fly home early. By the 5th day, the romance and beauty of Florence began to soften Molly, and the rest of the trip turned out to be wonderful. It was much like our week on Sanibel Island, where we had a fantastic time together. From that point on, we continued our routine, 2 wonderful weeks with Molly's sisters each year and 1 incredible week alone. Sounds perfect, right? And it was, until we decided to start a family. Molly and I always knew we wanted children eventually, but we were thoroughly enjoying our life together, which often included the company of her sisters and their partners, so we didn't rush into it. However, as Molly and her sisters hit their 30s and I turned 32, the biological clock started ticking loudly. Molly stopped taking her birth control pills, and within a few months, we began trying for a baby. I had no objections to the idea or the process. I've always loved being intimate with my beautiful wife. Our sex life was generally tender and loving rather than wild and uninhibited. We had our favorite positions, and while the more adventurous nights became rarer over the years, the intimacy remained. Every now and then, Molly would surprise me by being exceptionally passionate, and those nights where we indulged in multiple rounds of lovemaking became highlights. We always celebrated with champagne on birthdays or anniversaries, which heightened the excitement for both of us. But on one particular night, after Molly had been unusually aggressive, I jokingly teased her about it. It was a Saturday, and after returning from the grocery store with dinner ingredients, I heard her calling from the bedroom. When I walked in, I found her lying naked on her stomach on the bed, holding a bottle of massage oil. "I'm a little stressed today, cowboy," she murmured. "Do you think you could help me out?" It was an incredible experience. I thoroughly massaged her back and legs, her contented moans filling the room. Then, I turned her over and used my fingers, followed by my lips and tongue, until she climaxed 3 times. Our lovemaking that night was intense and fulfilling, ending with us lying together in a dreamy haze of satisfaction. Together, Molly and I ventured into the kitchen where she prepared some snacks. Dinner seemed to be off the agenda for the moment. Soon, we were back to tumbling around playfully. When we finally caught our breath, gazing at each other with smiles, I remarked, "Wow, that was something, Molly." Then, with a playful grin, I teased, "Or wait, maybe you're not actually Molly. Maybe I just got incredibly lucky with Amy or Hannah tonight." I'm not sure Molly has ever been this excited. Molly could tell I was joking, but instead of laughing or shooting back a witty retort, she shot me a cold, piercing look. Scott, this isn't funny. How could you think I would ever do something like that? Do you really think I'd share you with my sisters? As she glared at me, I felt the room's temperature drop by about 10 degrees. Molly, forgive me, I said quickly, trying to smooth things over. I was just joking, honey. I reached out to hug her, but she recoiled and stood up. I'm going to take a shower, she said, her voice icy with irritation. She disappeared into the bathroom, and I heard the lock click behind her. For the rest of that night and most of the following day, Molly kept her distance, clearly intent on making it known that certain topics were off limits. Finally, at dinner on Sunday, I apologized again, emphasizing that it was just a harmless joke. Molly seemed to soften a little. That evening, she let me snuggle up behind her in bed, and I breathed a sigh of relief. I didn't like it when Molly was mad at me, and I made a mental note never to joke about switching sisters again, despite finding it amusing that she had reacted so strongly. I remembered a story Molly had shared on our first date about substituting for Amy on a date with a high school student. It made me think of an incident a few weeks before our wedding when the topic came up again. Molly and I had a minor disagreement over which hotel to stay at for our honeymoon in Curacao. I ultimately gave in to her preference, but during our light-hearted argument, I jokingly suggested that if she didn't want me, maybe I'd marry one of her sisters. Molly had retorted with a laugh, I don't think they'd take you, babe. Both Amy and Hannah are light sleepers, and I've told them you snore sometimes. That could be a deal breaker. Better stick with me. All right, I had answered, if I can't have Amy or Hannah, I guess I'll still marry you. That had ended the conversation, so I had no idea why Molly would get so upset about the same joke years later. In any case, as I mentioned, it was the attempt to start a family that turned my life upside down. We'd been trying and enjoying the process for about 10 months. I'd heard that it often took couples a year or more to conceive, so I wasn't particularly worried. But Molly grew increasingly anxious about our lack of success and insisted that I get checked by our doctor. I went through the routine of sitting in a small room filled with adult magazines for a test, followed by the nerve-wracking wait for the results. A few days later, on a Friday while I was at work, Dr. Rennell called. I closed my office door to have a private conversation. Well, Scott, you don't have much to worry about, he said. Your sperm count is slightly lower than average, about 70% of the norm for your age. But it's nothing to be concerned about. Your sperm are healthy and strong, just less numerous. You and Molly should have no trouble conceiving, though it might take a little longer than some couples. This was reassuring news, and I was eager to get home and ease Molly's anxiety. But somehow, it slipped my mind during dinner. We ended up having a long discussion about the politics of Cincinnati, and the news about my sperm count completely escaped me. It wasn't until nearly 11 p.m., after the usual gathering of the sisters in our kitchen, that I remembered the test results. I was watching basketball on TV and then headed to bed. I often fell asleep before Molly, but as I was about to drift off, the thought of sharing the good news about my sperm count came back to me. I felt compelled to tell Molly immediately. So, I grabbed my robe and headed downstairs, planning to interrupt the sisters' conversation in the kitchen to let Molly know that everything was fine. As I walked through the living room toward the kitchen, I heard a burst of boisterous laughter from the three sisters through the closed swing door. I smiled to myself, reflecting once more on how intertwined our lives had become. I was about to head straight to the kitchen when I paused, curiosity getting the better of me. I couldn't help but eavesdrop on the lively conversation coming from there. It was completely innocent, I swear, I was just intrigued by the cheerful tones and lively banter. Little did I know, what I was about to overhear would shake the very foundation of my life. Voice number 1, filled with mock indignation, asked, "Well, if he's not the best, why do you always want to switch with me?" Voice number 2, giggling, replied, I didn't say Ari isn't great. I just mentioned that he doesn't handle private parts as skillfully as Scott does. Voice number 3, or was it still number 2? I could hardly tell, chimed in, besides, you greedy cow, you still get Ari more nights each week than any of us, plus the weekends. Another voice interrupted, so you probably shouldn't complain about your situation. More laughter followed. I stood there in stunned silence. The conversation was beyond anything I could have imagined. My mind raced, trying to grasp what I had just heard. The idea that Molly and her sisters might be swapping husbands was incomprehensible. I quietly sank into a nearby chair, trying to process the shock. I strained to catch more of the conversation, and what I heard next made my blood run cold. Well, if Scott's spermogram doesn't return to normal, we might need a plan B, said one voice. He was tested about a week ago, so we should have results any day now. Another voice, possibly Molly's, responded, no problem. I'll just spend a few nights with Ted when I'm most fertile. And at the end of the cycle, when I'm safe, I'll spend a couple of nights with Ari. The response was chilling. Under no circumstances, Molly. This isn't foolproof. You won't get Ari again until you're pregnant. The realization hit me like a freight train. Molly was planning to have Ted's child. The implications were staggering. Ted and I were similar in appearance, though he was a few inches taller, we shared the same hair and eye color, and had similar body types. Ari, on the other hand, was shorter and heavier. The thought of Molly conceiving a child with someone else was overwhelming. I remained frozen in the darkened living room, struggling to come to terms with the sudden collapse of my happy marriage. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. I needed to confront Molly, but my thoughts were scattered. Eventually, I retreated to the bedroom and slipped back into bed, trying to steady my racing heart. I knew I couldn't confront Molly without first gathering my thoughts. And besides, who knew which sister would end up in bed with me? I focused on calming my breathing, and a few minutes later, I felt someone slide into bed beside me. Assuming it was Molly, I felt a gentle kiss on my cheek and heard a soft voice say, "I love you, baby," just as Molly often did before bed. The familiarity of the gesture was almost unbearable. I wanted to scream at her, accuse her of cheating, but I lay still, controlling my emotions and waiting for her to fall asleep. After a while, I heard her breathing become slow and regular. I waited a full hour to be certain she was deeply asleep before getting out of bed. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became how they could pull off this deception. If they were simply swapping husbands for sex, changing clothes during evening meetings wouldn't be difficult. They all worked part-time as co-managers of the interior design store, so mornings were no problem. Weekends might pose a challenge, but we often had barbecues or social gatherings where switching could be easily arranged. A quick trip under some pretext or even a visit to my sister for a catalog could serve as a cover. While figuring out the logistics wasn't too difficult, understanding the why was more perplexing. Surely, as husbands, we should be able to tell our own wives apart from others. But the truth was, we had no reason to doubt the identity of the woman we were with. I had never suspected that Molly and her sisters had any reason to deceive us. As I pondered all of this, I realized that early in our marriage, Molly and I had established a bond of trust that I now saw had been deeply compromised. I used to cherish lying in bed at night, engaging in deep, meaningful conversations with Molly. Whether it was before or after sex, or sometimes instead of it, we would talk about everything, our relationship, our future plans, work, family, and all the little details of our lives. But things began to change, and I'm not exactly sure when it started. A few years ago, Molly began to discourage these late-night talks. She would come into the bedroom after spending time with her sisters, and we'd simply go to bed. Sometimes we'd have sex, sometimes not, but any attempt I made to start a conversation was met with a tired, "I'm really exhausted, honey. Let's discuss this tomorrow." Over time, all our important conversations, about our days or future plans, shifted to dinner or earlier in the evening. Late-night talks in bed became a rarity. I began to suspect this was a deliberate strategy. It seemed that the less we talked, the less chance there was for me to catch her in a lie or to uncover discrepancies in her memories. One night, I decided to take a drastic measure. Once I was sure Molly was asleep, I sneaked into the office and found the ink pad we used for stamping our checking accounts. I dabbed some permanent black ink on the tip of my finger. Then, back in the bedroom, I carefully made a small mark on her back, right side, midway between her shoulder blade and shoulder. It was no larger than a pencil eraser, and she wouldn't have noticed it unless she specifically checked her back in the mirror. I went to the bathroom, washed my finger with warm water and soap. As expected, the ink didn't come off completely, only some of it was removed despite vigorous scrubbing. I worked on my finger with a pumice stone until what was left of the ink was so faint it would be nearly invisible. Climbing back into bed, I grimaced as I contemplated the next steps. The initial shock had worn off, and I was now deeply angry. From what I had gathered from the women's conversations, Molly had betrayed me in a thorough and systematic manner, possibly over many years. It seemed she and her sisters had prioritized their bond over their commitments to their husbands. I felt used, deceived, and humiliated. I couldn't see any way to fix this. On Saturday afternoon, we had a barbecue at Ted's house. I waited until the women had gone inside, presumably to prepare food. Ted was busy at the grill, so I took the opportunity to ask Ari if he wanted to take a walk around the block. Ari, who was always a bit concerned about his weight, was eager for the exercise. Once we were at a safe distance from the house, I said, "Ari, if you don't mind, I'd like to discuss something personal with you for a few minutes. Is that okay?" "Of course, Scott. What's on your mind?" he replied. "Well, first let's agree that this conversation stays between us. I don't want Molly, Hannah, Amy, or even Ted to know about this. If anyone asks what we talked about during our walk, let's just say I was getting your thoughts on a possible trip to Greece next summer." Ari grinned and said, "My lips are sealed." I took a deep breath and then asked, "I'm a bit embarrassed, but I wanted to ask about your sex life with Hannah. Molly and I make love about once or twice a week, and I often wish it were more frequent. I'm just curious, do Hannah and you have a similar pattern?" Ari slapped me on the back with a hearty laugh. "I'm afraid you got the short end of the stick, mate. Hannah and I are at it almost every night, practically every night. We might skip a night if she's on her period or if one of us is really tired, but other than that, it's as regular as clockwork." He saw the look of disappointment on my face and grinned. "Guess you picked the wrong sister, huh? How could you have known? None of us did, really. I suppose I was just lucky." Trying to mask the rage I was feeling, I maintained a disappointed expression and said, "I suppose so, Ari. Tell me, has it always been like this? I mean, from the very beginning of your marriage?" He thought for a moment. "Pretty much. Hannah and I have this routine, or maybe you could call it a little game we play. Do you know how women tend to gather in someone's kitchen in the evenings?" I nodded, and he continued, "By the time she comes back home, I'm usually already in bed, reading or watching TV." As I walked back to the house, the weight of Ari's words and the reality of my situation pressed heavily on me. The disparity between my life with Molly and Ari's life with Hannah was stark, and it left me feeling more unsettled than ever. When Molly walks into the bedroom, she always greets me with that familiar expression on her face and a sultry voice, asking, "Well, big boy, how do you want me tonight?" I usually suggest something, and we end up doing it. It's almost always the same routine, but I'm not complaining. It sounds trivial, but as long as we're together in bed, I'm happy. He laughed heartily, and I tried to join in, though my mind was elsewhere. I had one more question. Molly and I used to talk a lot in bed about ourselves, our relationship, and so on, but in recent years, our bedroom time has become almost exclusively about sex and sleep. We don't have those deep conversations anymore. Is Hannah like that too? To a large extent, yes, he said, with a shrug. We seem to save those meaningful conversations for another time of day. It's not a big deal for me, but it's a bit like you and Molly, sex and then sleep. As we walked back to the house, Ari chatted enthusiastically about the Cincinnati Bengals, his second great love after Hannah. I responded with nods and affirmations, but my thoughts were distant, wandering in a cold, dark place. My anger was simmering beneath the surface. I managed to get through the afternoon and evening without losing my composure, though people noticed I was a bit withdrawn. Determined to maintain my facade, I took Molly out for her favorite Indian food, trying to be the cheerful companion she deserved. Around 10 p.m., Molly spent some time with Amy and her sisters before returning to the bedroom. As we prepared for bed, I approached her from behind, gently stroking her neck and shoulders. I searched for any signs of an ink trail from the previous night, but there was nothing. Okay, it's all over now, I thought. Damn it, whoever you are, it's time for you and your sisters to feel the heat. I turned to Molly and said, "How's that scratch on your leg? Let me see." She tensed slightly. "Scratch?" she asked, feigning innocence. "Yes, from yesterday when you bumped into the dishwasher door," I said, leaning over to look at her feet. "Oh, this?" she said too casually. "Everything's fine. There's not even a trace left." "Yeah, you're right," I replied, scrutinizing her leg. "I don't see any marks. It looked pretty bad before." I straightened up and saw her visibly relax. I went to the bathroom to brush my teeth, grinning to myself. The lack of a scratch confirmed that whichever sister was in my bedroom tonight wasn't the same one from the previous evening. A few minutes later, I was lying in bed, waiting for her. When she emerged from the bathroom, I greeted her with a playful tone. "Hey honey, let's end tonight like we did yesterday. It was amazing." "What do you mean, honey?" she asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. "Don't you remember?" I said. "You came downstairs with a sparkle in your eyes and said something like, 'So, big boy, how do you want me tonight?' It was so hot." I mentioned that maybe giving my manhood some credit would be good, and then you pushed me onto the bed, teased me until I went crazy, and rode me like a wild woman. It was fantastic. Don't you remember? For a moment, Molly looked completely stunned. Then, a pained expression crossed her face as she seemed to quickly think of an excuse. "Of course I remember, honey. I'm just not sure if I'm up for something so energetic tonight." "Okay," I said, "let's take it slow and gentle instead, but tell me those things you told me last night." She slid into bed and hugged me close, making it hard to see her face. "Of course, baby," she murmured. "I'll say whatever you want. I just want to excite you." "What things did you particularly like?" I asked, chuckling to myself. "You won't get off the hook that easily." "Oh, you know," she said, avoiding specifics. As we began to stroke and caress each other, I was instantly aroused despite my anger. But Molly seemed to struggle to get into the right mindset. My usual touches didn't seem to excite her at all. I pulled back to look at her. "Everything okay, honey?" I asked innocently. "It seems like you're not quite with me tonight." Catching my gaze, she replied, "Sorry, Scott. I guess I'm just a little tired and my stomach is bothering me, probably from the spicy food. Let's make love, but please don't expect me to be wild and crazy again tonight." I smiled lovingly and said, "Of course, Molly. Let's just keep it soft and gentle, missionary style." Tenderly, "Let's save all your passionate words for another night," Molly said with a relieved smile as she kissed me. What followed was a scene of ordinary, everyday intimacy between married couples, a routine that had been familiar and comfortable in our relationship, or so I thought. Sunday arrived, and with it, a plan to meet up with all three couples for brunch downtown at Trentino, a spot we all cherished. Afterward, we headed back to Ari and Hannah's place. The men gathered to watch the Bengals game, while the sisters spent the day chatting and laughing together. Everything seemed perfect, and I had been vigilant all morning, making sure Molly didn't contact either of her sisters in advance. I sensed that Molly was still seething from our earlier encounter. She was evidently upset, feeling that my Friday night partner, whoever it was, hadn't informed her properly about either the scratch on her leg or our intimate moments. As we sat down at Trentino, the waiter took our drink orders, and within seconds, Molly directed a pointed look at Hannah. "Hannah, I need to use the restroom. Could you come with me?" she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. They left, Molly with a stern, angry expression, and Hannah looking slightly confused. Several minutes passed before they returned, both women now looking pale and worried. They fumbled with their drinks and struggled to keep up with the conversation. They exchanged intense, furtive glances whenever they thought I wasn't looking. I suspected that Molly had confronted Hannah about not sharing details of our encounter, and Hannah's denial had left them both anxious. Amy seemed initially unaffected, continuing to chat cheerfully with us. However, after a while, she picked up on the tense atmosphere. Even though she wasn't aware of what had transpired, it was evident to everyone that something was amiss. As we finished our eggs Benedict, salmon omelets, and Belgian waffles, Amy said to Hannah with feigned casualness, "Han, one of my contacts is really bothering me. Could you take a look?" When they returned, the mood was markedly different. The three sisters sat at the table, pale and tense, avoiding eye contact with me and disengaging from the conversation. Their distress was palpable, and to my great satisfaction, it lingered throughout the day. While Ted, Ari, and I reveled in the Bengals' victory, the women seemed to retreat, spending hours in the back of the house. We didn't hear a word from them for a long stretch, and when it was time to leave, neither of my sisters-in-law could meet my gaze as we hugged goodbye. Dinner at our house was marked by an oppressive silence. I made an effort to maintain a cheerful demeanor, regaling Molly with funny anecdotes about work and our upcoming vacation plans. Despite my efforts, her smiles were fleeting, and her responses were monosyllabic. It was clear she was deeply troubled. Later, as we cleaned up the kitchen and watched TV, I feigned normalcy, all while observing the fear and distress in Molly's eyes. Around 9:15 p.m., she turned to me and said, "Honey, I'm going to go see Hannah for a while, okay?" "Sure, baby," I replied. "While you're gone, I'll probably start packing my things and loading them into the car. Of course, I'll need a truck for the furniture and other stuff, so I'll take care of that later in the week." Molly's face drained of color. "Scott, what are you talking about? Why do you need to pack your things?" I responded casually, "Because I'm leaving. You don't seriously think I'm going to stay in a house with a lying, cheating?" Her gasp interrupted me, and she stared at me, speechless. She knew what I meant, but she couldn't find the words to respond. "See you when you get back," I said, turning towards the stairs. "No, Scott, wait," she cried out, her voice trembling, but I ignored her pleas and went to pack my belongings. As I anticipated, Molly's first instinct was to call her sisters. Less than 3 minutes later, Molly appeared at the bedroom door, her face streaked with tears and her makeup running. "Honey, Amy and Hannah are here. Could you come downstairs and talk to us?" She looked distraught, her cheeks flushed with tears and her eyes filled with fear and desperation. For a moment, I hesitated, but then I descended the stairs, bracing myself for what would come next. For a moment, I actually felt a twinge of sympathy for Molly. I sighed and turned away, saying, "Yes, I'll come down in a minute." Quickly, I scanned the room for my small digital voice recorder, about the size of a cigarette pack, which I sometimes used for dictation while driving. After setting it to record, I slipped it into my pocket. When I entered the kitchen, 3 women were already seated at the table, their faces tense and troubled. I took my seat and looked around at them, waiting for someone to speak. The silence was palpable. None of them wanted to break it. Finally, Molly spoke up, her voice trembling. "Scott, you know how much I love you, right?" "Sorry," I replied coolly, Which sister are you? I'm Molly, she shouted, clearly frustrated. Your wife. Oh, really? I said, trying to mask my growing anger. Please, wait a moment. I walked behind her and checked her back, no marks. Then I checked the other two sisters, and on one of them, I found a mark. They all looked at me with confusion. I sat down again, trying to stay calm. Okay, let's say for argument's sake that you're Molly. Where did you sleep on Friday night when your sister was here? I pointed to the sister with the mark. She was in bed with me. They stared at me, wide-eyed. Take your time, I said. I'm not in a hurry. I'm sure there's a perfectly reasonable explanation for why at least 2, if not 3, of you have spent the night in my bed over the past 3 nights. The silence stretched on. Molly started crying, while the other 2 sat glumly. I pretended to stand up, saying, I need to pack my things. No, wait, Molly said urgently. I'll explain. Please, Scott, just give me a chance to make you understand. I wanted to scream at her that it was too late for explanations, but I realized that deep down, I wanted to hear what she had to say. What twisted rationale could they possibly offer for their actions? And would they be honest with me? Molly was sobbing too hard to speak, so one of her sisters took over. Scott, it was just a stupid game. It started as a joke, and I guess it just got out of hand. About a month ago, we joked about each other's husbands, what we liked and didn't like. Somehow, the idea came up to swap partners, and it started as a challenge. It probably seems like a terrible idea now, but at the time, it was just for fun. The sister continued, on Friday evening, we swapped clothes and went to each other's houses. Amy was with you, I was with Ted, and Molly was with Ari. Then on Saturday, we switched again for the barbecue. It was foolish, Scott. We all realize that now, and you're probably very angry. But please, give Molly a chance to make amends. She loves you so much. Just look at how unhappy she is. She gestured towards Molly, who was still crying uncontrollably. I turned to Amy. So, Amy, how did it go? How does sex with me compare to sex with Ted? Amy looked stunned. I don't know, Scott. It was great, actually. Great? I said, incredulous. Please refresh my memory. What exactly happened? Amy avoided my gaze. I actually don't remember. I stared at her, baffled. It's been just 2 nights since you swapped husbands with one of your sisters, and you can't remember what happened. Are you having early-stage Alzheimer's or something? I turned back to Hannah. Nice try, but your story is complete nonsense. It was Amy who was in my bed on Friday night. I put a black ink mark on her back while she was asleep, and it's still there. But we didn't have sex. And I would appreciate it if you didn't insult my intelligence by pretending this was the first time. They gasped, but I ignored their reactions and continued. Do you think I don't know that Ari is considered the best in bed? You 3 acknowledged that he has 7 nights a week with one of you, while I barely get 2 nights a week. But I get the consolation prize, don't I? Let's save all your passionate words for another night, I said. My tone softened as Molly's kiss brought a brief sense of relief. What followed was a routine and mundane act of intimacy between us, just as it had been countless times before. I had always believed this was the way it was supposed to be with my wife, Molly. Sunday turned out to be a day of upheaval. We had planned brunch downtown at Trentino, a favorite spot for all 3 couples. Afterward, we headed to Ari and Hannah's house. While Ted, Ari, and I enjoyed the Bengals game, the sisters were deep in conversation and laughter, seemingly in high spirits. I had been vigilant all morning, making sure Molly didn't contact either of her sisters beforehand. However, Molly's frustration was palpable. It seemed she was still seething from our earlier confrontation, convinced that my Friday night partner, whoever it was, hadn't adequately informed her about the events of the previous night. As we sat down at Trentino, the waiter took our drink orders. Without hesitation, Molly turned to Hannah and said, "Hannah, I need to use the restroom. Will you join me?" The two of them left, Molly's expression grim and Hannah looking slightly confused. Several minutes later, they returned, their faces pale and their demeanor uneasy. They fumbled with their drinks and struggled to follow the conversation, exchanging anxious glances whenever they thought I wasn't watching. Clearly, Molly had confronted Hannah, who must have denied any wrongdoing, leading to their distress. Amy, initially unaffected, soon picked up on the tension. She was unaware of the details but could sense something was wrong. As we finished our meals, eggs Benedict, salmon omelets, and Belgian waffles, Amy said to Hannah with feigned casualness, "Han, one of my contacts is acting up. Could you check it out?" When they returned, the atmosphere was even more strained. The three sisters sat at the table, their faces ashen, avoiding eye contact with me. Their anxiety was palpable, and it was evident that Molly had shared my confrontation with Hannah, causing the sisters distress. Ted, Ari, and I relished the Bengals' victory, while the women seemed to retreat into the back of the house. We didn't hear from them for hours, and when it was time to leave, neither of Molly's sisters could meet my gaze. Dinner at our place was marked by an oppressive silence. I tried to keep the mood light by sharing amusing work stories and vacation plans, but Molly's responses were curt, her smiles forced. Her fear and unhappiness were evident. Later that evening, as we cleaned up and watched TV, Molly suddenly said, "Honey, I'm going to visit Hannah for a bit." "Sure, sweetheart," I replied. "While you're out, I'll start packing my things and putting them in the car. I'll need a truck for the furniture and other stuff, so I'll handle that later this week." Molly's face went pale. "Scott, what are you talking about? Why do you need to pack your things?" I replied nonchalantly, "Because I'm leaving. I can't stay in a house with a lying, cheating." Her gasp was cut off by the finality of my words. She understood, but couldn't articulate her thoughts. "I'll see you when you get back," I said, turning towards the stairs. "No, Scott, wait," she pleaded, her voice trembling. I ignored her and proceeded to pack my belongings. As anticipated, Molly quickly called her sisters. Less than 3 minutes later, Molly appeared in the bedroom doorway, tear-streaked and desperate. "Honey, Amy and Hannah are here. Could you come down and talk to us?" She looked devastated, her makeup smudged and her eyes wide with fear. For a moment, I hesitated, but then I descended the stairs to confront the situation. When I reached the kitchen, I laid everything bare. Molly was sobbing almost hysterically, while her sisters looked on grimly. My patience was wearing thin, but I needed them to admit the truth. "You have one more chance to tell me the truth," I said, my voice cold. "This time, I want to hear it from Molly. How long have you been cheating on me with each of your husbands?" Molly looked at me, her eyes red and pleading. The room was silent, thick with tension. Finally, she turned away, staring down at the table. After what felt like an eternity, Hannah spoke up. "It wasn't entirely her fault, Scott. Amy and I insisted, but it was only occasional, maybe a few times a year." "Okay," I said, my tone flat. "So what happened next?" The room fell silent again, and then Amy admitted, "It became more frequent over time." "So, the three of you regularly divided 3 husbands among yourselves?" I asked, trying to process the revelation. Molly nodded, her expression pitiable. "And when did it become 7 nights a week for Ari and casual sex for me?" I pressed. Molly didn't answer or even look at me. "How many nights did Ari spend with you each week?" I demanded. "1 or 2, Molly mumbled. "Just wonderful," I said, feeling a mix of anger and resignation. I had heard all I needed and didn't want to hear any more. "It was just sex, honey," she said, her voice breaking as she looked at me. "It had nothing to do with love, nothing to do with how I feel about you." I could hardly contain my rage. "Scott, what are you doing?" she asked, bewildered. I responded, I know very well that you were hoping to get pregnant with Ted's child because you thought I wasn't up to the task. She gasped, "No, Scott," and moved to embrace me. I pushed her away, and she stumbled against the refrigerator. "Don't ever touch me again," I said, my voice filled with contempt. "You've betrayed me in nearly every way possible, with the help of your two sisters. Now, the three of you can share Ari and Ted, or maybe add someone new to your rotation." Before they could reply, I stormed through the swing door and out of the kitchen. I grabbed my suitcase and walked out the front door, leaving them behind. Though I could hear the sound of their crying in the kitchen, I didn't look back. I spent a sleepless, angry night at a Hyatt hotel and, the next morning, took a day off from work to see a lawyer and visit the bank. I urgently set up a lunch meeting with Ari and Ted, prompting Ted to cancel our scheduled appointment. At the diner, as we sat in a booth and ordered sandwiches, I wasted no time. "Guys," I began, "I don't know if you'll believe this, but our wives have been cheating on us. More specifically, they've been involved with each of us. It looks like this has been going on for years." Ari was stunned, but to my surprise, Ted merely nodded. "I suspected something like this," he said. "Why?" I asked. "There were too many instances when Amy forgot things or didn't remember conversations from earlier," Ted explained. "I didn't want to make accusations without proof, so I kept notes and planned to confront you once I had more concrete evidence." I told them about the overheard conversation and the ink mark trick. Ted looked thoughtful, while Ari repeated, "Unbelievable. Lord, unbelievable." When I finished, I played a recording of the conversation I had with the sisters the previous night. As the tape ended, we looked at each other solemnly and began discussing our next steps. Both Ari and Ted decided to call their offices and inform them that they wouldn't be coming in that day. I confirmed that I was divorcing Molly, and there was no turning back. We talked for several hours, each of us grappling with the reality of the situation. Ironically, amidst the chaos, I realized how much had changed, and how deep the betrayal had cut. I had never felt closer to my two brothers-in-law. They were genuinely great guys, and saying goodbye to them was tough. I found an apartment that I liked, and by the end of the week, I had moved in. I drove back with a truck to pick up a few pieces of furniture and made the new place feel like home. Once I had cleared out the last of our clothes and belongings from the old house, I began to focus on my new life. Molly tried reaching out to me constantly, calling my work, my cell phone, and leaving messages. I instructed my assistant to decline her calls and quickly arranged for a new cell number. Keeping my apartment's phone number unlisted also turned out to be a wise decision. I filed for divorce and started making plans for the future. On Thursday, I had an unsettling conversation with Barbara, a friend from work. It was obvious to everyone in the office that I was distracted and irritable, but Barbara was still curious about what was going on. I ended up sharing a lot with her, more than I intended. Her reaction was a mix of surprise, sympathy, and an odd hint of satisfaction that made me uncomfortable. "I'm so sorry, Scott," she said. Her tone was sincere but conflicted. "Of course, I'm not happy about what happened to you, but, well, I've always thought that you and I could be a good match." I was taken aback. Barbara had always been a kind, generous, and incredibly attractive person, tall, beautiful, and someone I had been vaguely aware of but never considered because of my love for Molly. Now, her words made me rethink everything. We talked more, keeping our conversation private, but it was clear Barbara saw that I was viewing her in a new light. Through my lawyer, Molly had begged for a chance to meet and explain herself. I was skeptical that anything she could say would alter the situation, but I agreed to the meeting. She arrived in my lawyer's conference room, looking both sad and beautiful. I waited for her to settle in before speaking. "So, Molly," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral, "how are you? Pregnant with Ted's child yet?" Her face flushed. "No, Scott, I'm not having a baby with Ted or anyone else. I'm not with him, and I won't get pregnant by anyone but you. You know, That night I overheard you in the kitchen. I was about to tell you that Dr. Randall said my sperm count was fine, just a bit low but still capable of having children. There's no need for Ted's help. She looked at me, eyes pleading. Please, Scott, let me explain. I feel so awful about everything. Do you think I feel any less miserable than you do? Is that so? I replied. All right, I'll listen, but don't try to justify it by saying you love me or that it has nothing to do with us. Just don't. Molly seemed hesitant but began to explain. This wasn't about us, Scott. It was just something crazy that Hannah, Amy, and I have always done. We've always been close, sharing clothes, gossip, friends, even boyfriends. It's just our little game, never meant to hurt anyone. Did you do this with all your boyfriends? I asked, struggling to process her words. Almost everyone we got close to, Molly admitted. It was our way of connecting, and I guess we thought it made us closer. We shared everything, and when you and I got married, I thought it would stop. And it did, for a while. Wait a minute, I interjected. Did your sister sleep with me while we were dating? Molly's face turned crimson. Yes, a couple of times. I didn't really want it to happen, especially when things started getting serious between us, but it was our pattern, and they were insistent. I couldn't help but respond sarcastically. Well, I guess I passed the test since you didn't leave me. Molly's silence was deafening. Scott, you don't understand. You were played, and it was never meant to be personal. It was just a part of our routine. Ari was more appealing in bed, and that's why he was involved instead of you. How do you think that makes me feel? I shot back, my voice rising. What could possibly be worth all of this? Molly's eyes filled with tears, but I was beyond caring. The betrayal was deep, and the sense of manipulation left me feeling hollow and enraged. Wait, don't say anything, I cut her off sharply. I don't want to hear it. Molly's lips trembled as she tried to speak. Scott, I know it was terrible, but you know you also slept with all three of us. But I didn't know that you... Stop, I interrupted, my irritation growing. Haven't you realized this yet? Even if we had talked about swapping partners, which I would never agree to, I would still find pleasure and excitement in being with someone new. But it wasn't about that for me. It was always you. You were the one I loved more than anything in the world. Not some new and exciting person. I'm increasingly frustrated with how little you and your sister seem to understand the gravity of what you've done. I took a deep breath and continued, trying to keep my voice steady. Listen, it's simple. I was your husband. You should have put me above everyone else. Our relationship should have been your top priority, above your relationships with anyone else. But you didn't do that. You put Hannah and Amy before me. You prioritized sex with Ari over me. You even planned to get Ted pregnant without telling me a word. For God's sake. I was seething now. And now you want to have them all, but you won't have me. I've truly had enough. I stood up, preparing to leave. Molly's sobs grew louder as she cried, but baby, I don't want them. I don't need my sisters. I need you. I looked at her with a cold expression. Well, isn't that nice? After all these years, you finally decided to choose me over your sisters. But now it's not about your choice anymore, it's about mine. And I choose to be without the woman who lied to me, cheated on me, and made a complete fool of me for years. Molly buried her face in her hands, her cries muffled as I made my way to the door. She made no attempt to stop me as I headed for the exit. In that moment, life seemed a bit clearer, and I felt an unexpected sense of liberation. I started dating Barbara soon after, and by the third date, I discovered there were other women in the world who could bring joy into my life. Barbara was energetic and appreciative. Our first night together extended into a whole weekend filled with heat and excitement. While I wasn't sure if it would turn into something serious, it certainly made me feel better. We continue to date and have sex frequently, but Barbara is smart enough to understand my current confusion. She doesn't pressure me, which I truly value. As for Ari, he decided against kicking Hannah out, which wasn't entirely surprising. After all, he was her first choice in bed, and the revelations about their activities didn't hit him as hard as they did Ted and me. Nonetheless, Ari imposed a strict condition on Hannah: she had to grow her hair long so she could never switch places with her sisters without his knowledge. He warned her that if she ever messed with him, me, Ted, or anyone else again, she would be left penniless. He made it clear that he'd be open to occasional sex with Amy or Molly, but only on his terms, not theirs. Ari mentioned with a grin that Hannah looked pretty angry when he laid down these rules, but she kept her mouth shut. She knew she was on very thin ice. Ted found a way to inflict the most pain on Amy, though it was unintentional. He secured an excellent job in Chicago and told Amy he would be moving there in 3 weeks. He gave her an ultimatum: you can move with me and we'll find a counselor to try and fix our marriage, or you can stay in Cincinnati with your sisters. Choose now. Amy was caught in a terrible dilemma. She couldn't let Ted go, but she couldn't bear to live without her sisters. It was a tough situation for her. As for me, I felt a mix of satisfaction and sorrow. The betrayal was deeply painful, but I was determined to move forward. The story of my experiences might seem intense, but it's nothing compared to what's to come. If you're under 18, this isn't the place for you. Stay tuned for the next chapter. It's going to be something you won't want to miss.